So I'm first going to give an intro to the panel, and then I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. So today we're here to talk about the fact that beavers need habitat, right? And healthy riparian habitats need water. Pretty simple concepts, especially for this audience. But nothing is simple about water in the West, especially here west of the 100th meridian. But you don't have to live west of the 100th meridian to know that water is complicated out here. You just have to read the news, right? We fight over it here. So how water works here is under our Constitution in Colorado, water belongs to the people, and a person or entity can secure a right to put that water to beneficial use. The word we use for that is a usufructuary right, which sounds like an expletive, but it's not, I promise. And historically, it was really about putting water to consumptive use for the highest economic output, right? So mining, farming, growing cities, etc. So it wasn't until the 1970s that the Colorado created a water right for the environment called the in-stream flow water right. And it was revolutionary, and it certainly has provided protections for Colorado streams for now 50 years. We just celebrated the 50-year anniversary of it. But it's a non-consumptive right. So it's basically like a passive flow right that's designed to keep a fish's back wet. It doesn't account for any consumptive use that nature may need. So that brings me back to the topic today, restoring the natural function of streams and wetlands that have been degraded, whether we're doing that through human intervention or beaver translocation and colonization, that certainly can alter the timing of flow. It can change evapotranspiration rates or even evaporative loss off surface area of wetlands. And all of these trade-offs certainly seem reasonable to a crowd like this. But in an increasingly arid state like Colorado, that water that's being consumed by the now restored stream or beaver dam stream arguably belongs to somebody downstream. So the questions that we're going to talk about and debate today are: one, should a stream restoration project have to secure a water right through Colorado's water courts? Or should a beaver dam need a water right? Or should the beavers have to go to water court with
yes,
with little beaver hands and fight? Yes, okay, there we go. So of course, this crowd probably thinks, well, yeah, healthy streams provide benefits for everybody: late season flows, more stable stream channels, less susceptible to flood and fire, etc. It's good for society, and certainly these restoration projects don't have the time or resources to go through a multi-year complicated water court process that is, the outcome of which would be uncertain. But then tell that to a struggling farmer in the San Luis Valley where the water commissioner is shutting down their well because they don't have the proper augmentation plan because they can't afford the hundreds of thousands of dollars to secure that. So that's when it starts to get more complicated. So this is obviously a very Colorado-centric topic, but social barriers exist to the restoration of streams and wetlands and beaver populations across the world. And so hopefully the principles that we'll be applying here in just a moment to this debate will be relevant for the work that you do wherever you're here from. So I'm going to stop talking for just a moment and turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and offer a little perspective on this issue. Sean, do you mind starting?
Thank you. Sean Cronin. I'm with the St. Vrain Water Conservancy District. Good to see some familiar faces in the room. Usually know me in different capacities, but to show you that I'm with you, I brought my beaver hat from Colorado's first Buc-ee's, which if you haven't been, don't kill yourself to go there. It's just a gas station. But they do have good beaver swag if you're into beavers. So I've been working in Colorado since 1997 and worked in stream restoration work prior to that. And when I moved to Colorado, I thought, well, this is Colorado. I mean, you have these great Coors Light commercials and they must really care about rivers. And this was, again, 1997, and started looking into stream restoration work and working for Extension Service and other folks. And they said, Colorado is more about water rights and water quantity, not really water quality. And so I thought, well, I guess I'll learn a little bit about that. And my mentors and bosses tried to teach me about how people own water and we count for every drop. And I thought, this is the most maddening thing I've ever come across. And you get the right to take water out of the river and put it to some use. And you don't really have to, you could dry up the river and go see these dry up points. Are you kidding me? This is just not right. So it took a while to sort of adjust and get accustomed to that reality. And as Kelly had pointed out, the system has evolved and adapted over time. It's extremely slow in evolving and adapting. But I think this conversation is helpful for that evolution, and I'm happy to be here and provide some perspective from the water rights perspective.
Thanks, Sean. Mark?
I'm Mark Beardsley from EcoMetrics. I'm in Buena Vista. I lived in Fairplay for 20 years before that, in the middle of South Park, and that's where a lot of our work is. I am a wetlands ecologist, and my passion is restoring wetlands to their historical condition, and that led me to an appreciation pretty early on of beavers, because almost everywhere we saw wetlands in the Southern Rockies, it was because there were beavers there. And the water rights issue is one that's sort of haunted me and also intrigued me for most of my career, going back to like the mid 2000s, when we were very timid about about what we thought we were able to do as far as restoring streams and mostly restoring wetlands, really. We were scared. There was this sort of unwritten feeling that, like, if you did anything that caused water to go out of the banks of a stream, whoa, hello. So a stream, like, was defined in Colorado law as water flowing in a channel that's confined by a stream bed and banks. So what if the system you want to restore doesn't follow those rules? And so I guess I'll fast forward to about 5 or 6 years ago, we really started to just say, well, let's just start doing it, because I think it's okay. And the fear was both legal, like I don't want somebody coming and suing me and taking my house away, but mostly it was about respect for people that actually use that water. Like, you don't want to take something that belongs to somebody else, even if you think you're Robin Hood and doing it for the greater good. So one of the ideas behind this whole session here was, see if we can address this issue in a civil manner that's led by curiosity and learning about different perspectives. Because as this issue kind of came to a forefront in Colorado the last couple of years, it frankly got kind of a little bit ugly, and people were caricaturing other sides. The water people were starting to portray ecologists in one way, and we were portraying the water people in ways that probably weren't accurate. So this kind of came up, and Kelly had the idea of, like, why don't we just take you two guys with these very different angles on the same issue and just have a civil conversation and do it in front of a bunch of people. So it's unscripted and unrehearsed, and you're about to see it.
So are you guys all game for that? Sweet. All right, so we're going to go ahead and talk through various arguments around this issue. Only our panelists are going to work really hard, particularly at the end, to apply the principle of charity. And what does that mean? So the principle of charity suggests that we should assume good intentions about others and their ideas and give them the benefit of the doubt before criticizing them. I think we can probably apply that in all of our relationships. And and it's also about, at least in my opinion, I think it's also about seeking to understand each other's context. I think context is everything. So I think I speak for the panelists in saying that by applying the principle of charity to the work that we do, all of our conflicts, definitely we have a better chance of resolving those conflicts. And I've also observed both of these panelists apply the principle of charity in their work. So I did want to offer that caveat before we really go at each other in this debate. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first question, and you guys can decide who responds first. Beavers, what's good about them and what's bad about them? And Mark, you can't take the whole time talking about what's great about beavers.
Good, because I could and I would if you let me, but I don't have to because the whole morning session was really about what's good about beavers and everybody here is here because they probably think there's something good about beavers. Maybe a few of you out there are here because you are worried about the things that beavers do that might be not so good. So I'll actually address that second question a little more, which is also fairly easy for me to answer because I'm oftentimes the guy that people call when beavers are causing trouble on their land, when they're damming their irrigation ditches, when they're blocking road culverts. And that is sort of the vein that I think a lot of society sees beavers in as a nuisance species that breaks their stuff, floods their roads out. So solving, as a nuisance species, part of, I guess I see that firsthand. So there's one negative thing about beavers. And then the one that's probably going to be most poignant to this discussion is, well, they restore and maintain wetlands. That sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? But it's also a threatening thing to somebody who's trying to keep track of all the evapotranspiration that goes on in a watershed. And somebody downstream who might be concerned that when beavers move in, I don't know. It looks, from mere perception anyway, when beavers move in upstream from you on a really tiny creek that you have very small water right on, it's a little intimidating because it looks like they're stealing all the water.
I hear you. I respect you. What's good and bad about them? I don't think there's good and bad necessarily in beavers. They're well-intended little creatures. The bad, certainly what Mark had said, we work with ditch companies and they gum up systems, and so they have to find ways to address that. My first introduction with beavers gumming up a ditch and a diversion, they came to us and said, is there something we could do? Because we really don't want to just take a bullet to the beaver. And we said, well, we'll call around and find out some solutions. And she might be in the room. There's a woman down in Boulder that invented, I think, the beaver deceiver. Is that something everyone's familiar with? Where it really fakes out the beaver to think, life is grand, and they just move on and go somewhere else. But that location, the beaver dam and where the beaver was messing around, was so huge they couldn't actually put the deceiver in there. So we hired a company to trap it and relocate it. And we got a call about a month later, the same damn beaver, pardon the pun, further down where it was relocated. So, it's just the gift that keeps on giving, and we just have to figure that out from a sort of management standpoint. As Mark highlighted, the slowing of the dams themselves are what causes the water community pain and angst. It's the slowing of water. And right, wrong, and different, we have built a system on getting water from point A to point B as quickly as possible for a variety of different reasons that are both practical and kind of maddening. So anything that slows that delivery of water just causes a reaction. And some of it, again, is a very practical sort of reaction. If I don't get my water today, tomorrow it might be out of priority and I can't take delivery, that sort of thing. Right now, St. Vrain Left-Hand Water Conservancy District is delivering water out of a gravel pit reservoir to the thousandths of a CFS. That's how closely we calculate water. So if water is being slowed, instead of evaporating to a thousandths of a acre foot or a thousandths of a whatever, put a unit on it, that's something the water community quickly relates to and starts doing math. So the good and the bad, if you're on the side of you might be in priority tomorrow or the next day, they might be good. You sort of holding that water back and it might be delivered later on. Again, the bad is if you're in priority today. So it's like all things in water and all things in natural systems, it's complicated. But I don't think the beavers themselves are the bad. We just got to, as humans, figure out can we manage those systems in a way that, have our cake and eat it too, be able to make a water delivery and provide for nature.
Okay, so follow-up question. Either of you can answer this. How would you quantify how much water, whether it's the Beaver dam or the restored wetland? What methods would you follow to see whether you're injuring a downstream water right or not?
So I'll take a shot at it. So the raise of hands, how many of you from Colorado? Okay, lots of Colorado people. Raise of hands, how many of you heard of prior appropriation or first in time, first in right? A lot of hands. How many of you have worked in it and think it's nuts? Okay, decent number of hands. Okay, so you kind of get the gist of some of this conversation. It's complicated, it's a little wonky, but generally speaking, if there is a consumption of water, that can be calculated. There's a variety of different engineers you can hire that'll do consumption. Mark and I were talking before it started. We had a post-flood restoration project. The surface acres of a pond was about 3 acres. It had really no natural features whatsoever. It was a lined gravel pit, just went straight down slopes, didn't really have anything. Wanted to rebuild it with benches and create habitat, etc. Talked about putting in cattails, went to the state and said, we'd like to do this. And they said, that 3 acres of surface acres evaporated a certain amount and we can calculate that. You put in vegetation, it's going to consume, just like you would evaporative loss, it would consume a similar amount of water. And that actually pencils out to be more than it was prior to the flood when it was just evaporating. So there's all sorts of ways that you can go ahead and calculate that. The calculus on the slowing of water is really just, again, if you're in priority, and in any given season, you could be in and out of priority within a single day. You could be in priority and out of priority. You could be in priority, out of priority within days, period. And you don't know when the water's being slowed, is that going to impact my ability to divert water? And some ditches are so junior, or some ditches, when they are in priority, it might be their only big time to divert in that given year. And if they're growing local food, et cetera, you want to be able to accommodate that. They are not going to take too kindly to having to wait for that water because they might get kicked out down the road. So that calculus is more just a feeling because you don't know what tomorrow holds, but they have good historic practice to know, hey, typically I'm in for a couple days and you're slowing that water and you're ruining my ability to take that water.
So, Mark, similar question, maybe slightly different spin. So those methods of quantifying the water consumed by natural wetlands or beaver complexes, what are they missing?
I mean, methodologically, probably nothing, but philosophically, I think there's a massive difference between measuring the effects of an artificial feature like a gravel pit or pond that's now evapotranspirating and storing water. I don't think those same rules apply to natural features. And I don't think prior appropriation was ever really designed to manage the water loss from natural features in a watershed. And if it is, then it's failing miserably because there's no way we can keep track of all the evaporation that takes place on every geological feature on Earth, or the transpiration that happens from every plant on Earth. So I would say, I think prior appropriation and the just the appropriation of water in general applies really to just the water that's available for use, and it doesn't guarantee that nature's going to provide. It has to be done. It's almost like the talk that we had this morning from the Utes, where it's like we have to kind of live within what nature can provide. And so I think we're going to get to a topic that's probably maybe make this a little bit more sense, is what we mean by restoration. And to me, where I'm kind of going with what I mean for restoration is trying to restore a system to the way it had worked, prior to human disturbance, which for all intents and purposes to me means, prior to a couple hundred years ago, when the state really started getting flooded with new people and settled, and industry and technology came, and beavers were tracked out of the state at that particular time. So I might have spun a little far off of your actual question, but.
So something to add that I think is helpful for this conversation, and perhaps for all of you in the room as practitioners, there's a term that Mark and I have kicked around from time to time, and he just sort of touched on it, historical. So that's a term that water folk are familiar with, and they say historical consumptive use. And when they say historical consumptive use, it's not pre-development. In fact, like the drought of 2002 is considered historical. In fact, you want to capture that when you're talking about what a water right might have in way of consumptive value. So that was something that, with the stream restoration bill that Colorado had gone through, and even the more recent dredge and fill, occurred to me that at times, as Mark highlighted earlier, you had sort of camps of folks that were talking amongst themselves and not necessarily talking with each other. And when they did talk to each other, they used words that they were familiar with, but each one interpreted differently. And so that's, for whatever it's worth, it's slowing your vocabulary down, and perhaps even, as was mentioned earlier, have that curiosity factor and ask, so what does historical mean to you? And in the water community, if you go back to the 50s or 60s, that's a long time ago in terms of the water right consumption. We fully recognize how water got developed and going back to the 1800s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as far as going to water court and defining that value, you don't go way back to what Mark is talking about in terms of how these systems functioned. So that's just a barrier that we need to each, as water professionals, come together and sort of talk through and make sure that we're saying the same thing.
And Sean just mentioned the stream restoration bill that we worked on in 2023, that the intent was to clarify what scale and type of stream restoration projects wouldn't be required to secure a water right. And it was a pretty fierce battle, I'd say. There was definitely some camps that were dug in. Folks were able to come together and compromise and come up with sort of a pared down bill, but there's still, I think, some lingering questions out there as far as what is or is not allowed, what would need a water right or not. So just a little bit of context on what Sean and I think Mark earlier had mentioned.
So one other thing, and Left Hand Watershed Center, raise your hand. Shout out. I know many of you in the room have worked on various restoration projects, and what the stream restoration bill intended to do is deal with some of the issues, and Mark raised one of them about, I'll try to put words in Mark's mouth, that nature ought not to sort of step in line in the prior appropriation system, that there ought to be that first, and then the rest of us kind of peel off from that. We know from stream restoration projects that if you wanted to put in some vegetative plantings and whatnot, you'd have to get augmentation water, and St. Vrain Left Hand Water Conservancy District is an augmentation provider, and we calculate down to that thousandths of a decimal. This little plant has this much water, and in Colorado, you have to replace in time, place, and amount and the exact time that that loss occurs, at the exact place, and the exact amount of that loss. That's how that system works. So again, that mental barrier when we're talking about these larger concepts, when you're talking to water right owners, they're looking at it through those lenses of, okay, you're consuming water and it has to be time, place, and amount. And what the stream restoration bill was really intended to be able to accomplish is, for some of these smaller projects that probably actually balance the system pretty well, how are you going to come up with the water or the dollars to be able to make time, place, and amount? So the original discussion was sort of shoving people in the augmentation space, and that didn't turn out to be the case. And I think that's some of the next chapter of conversations is where do beavers fall into that? And Kelly, as you heard earlier, is advocating for the beavers to go to water court.
I did not say that. For the record, that's not the state of Colorado's position. Right, Mark, do you follow?
Yeah, and I think that's where I have a problem. That's why I'm also, I guess I'll just admit I'm pretty disappointed in how the stream restoration legislation came down, because I was hoping it would address sort of that key issue, and I think that key issue was what is historical, what can we expect these watersheds to provide, what type of water is there out there, and certainly the conditions, the natural conditions that existed in the 1700s prior to the fur trade were much different than what, I think Sean's suggesting that the legal people are looking at as what's historical, like the 50s. And this is kind of just for a personal anecdote, like when I began my restoration career, I thought I was really clever, like going back and finding historical aerial imagery and going to the Forest Service office and like going through all the black and white photos and thinking like, wow, I found photos from 1938. Holy cow, like I can see what this landscape used to be before human impacts. And then I read some history books and I was like, oh, so now I'm only looking 3 generations into the massive effects of the fur trade settlement. So I think if there's and I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of water providers about this, and I was absolutely shocked, really, because I was told not to expect this, but what I found when I actually sat down and talked to people like Sean and just openly like this was that none of them disagreed with the idea that you should be able to restore the natural wetland conditions. Like that wasn't a contentious issue. What became sort of contentious is what defines a natural system. And so, but to me, that's a huge win, because now we're basically in the realm of an empirical question, something that you can debate and talk about constructively, because then as a dreamer, you look at the pictures that Ellen showed and that Emily showed this morning, of these, that I show a lot of these giant beaver wetland complexes. I'm like, we could have these back, like, and all the great things that come with them. And that might be realistic and it might not, but it's something I think we can at least debate, perhaps in a civil manner.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Mark? So, we can talk about restoring to a historic condition or pre-disturbance condition, but in this modern climate, very different climate than we had at statehood, before statehood, is that realistic, or are we restoring for climate resilience? Like what if it's not really about restoring to a historic condition?
Well, I mean, I guess I shouldn't say the historic condition is your model for how the ecosystem could work, and you don't really have to put it back to exactly how it was, but putting all those parts together, and we're at a beaver conference, for crying out loud, I can say it, like getting the keystone species back and letting it kind of do its thing is one feature of that, and I think it's hugely possible, and there's huge amounts of opportunity in a lot of places. There's also a huge amount of places where it's not possible because our human infrastructure and our human footprint has changed everything. I don't think the climate's changed enough to where it's not possible for beavers to live. I think they are going to adapt to that just fine, honestly, at least in my lifetime. So I think that's still a noble aspiration, and where I work in the headwaters, mostly on Forest Service and BLM land up high, I see opportunity all over the place. So, and I want us to be able to take advantage of that. But I also want to be able to do that in a way that doesn't hurt somebody downstream.
So we've all heard location, 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 and Mark highlighted. I think we're gonna, in Colorado, we're going to see more of it, and I think that just depends on the location. I can envision. So let me jump tracks a little bit. Costs for operations of ditches and water rights are getting more and more expensive, and will continue to get more expensive. We're making a lot of progress in forest restoration work, but we're not gonna solve that tomorrow. And so between now and when we really get ahead of the wicked problem of dense forests, we're gonna have big fires, and they're gonna release a ton of junk, and that's gonna increase maintenance. And so I can envision these sorts of solutions and constructed natural systems as being a bridge towards a more resilient system that can handle maintenance better for the owners of the water rights. And you might actually see them advocating for these kinds of things at a particular location because they've rationalized that it helps more with maintenance and doesn't impact their water rights. It may be someone else further downstream has a different take on it. So I do think that would be possible. I'll go back to my language comment just with a quick story. There was, I want to say it was around 2015 or something. We had a whole bunch of hail in our area, and just the way being familiar with how those storms come out of Longs Peak and into the valley. These hailstorms sort of came out of the north in different locations, and they were just sort of nutty. And I talked to a farmer who they homesteaded in that area and had 4 different farms, and they had books back from the homesteading days, and they would record daily weather. And he said, I looked through the books, and we've never had one of their fields. They'd never ever had hail. That history way back then, they'd never had hail. And I said, well, yeah, that's interesting. And he says, so something might be going on, but I will not say climate change. So don't say climate change. Something's going on. And if something's going on, what do we want to do about it? And I think folks are open to that conversation.
All right, so I'm going to ask just a basic but big question. So does nature need a water right to be natural? Do stream restoration projects need water rights? Do beavers need water rights?
Oh, you just turned your one question into 3. But does nature need a water right? I would emphatically say no, because if we start trying to put legal limits on what nature can and can't do, I think we're going down a really dangerous, slippery slope. And it's something that I think is going to be unmanageable, and philosophically, it just doesn't make any sense to me. Do stream or wetland restoration projects need a water right? I'd also say no if they are truly restoring, a native and natural habitat. And I do have in mind one possible exception, and I might let Sean answer before I go there.
Go.
Well, I think that
So that I can get the last word.
okay, yeah, no, I'll be charitable and give Sean the last word, because I think it'll be a charitable too. But the exception that I would think of, and this is hypothetical, but it's not hypothetical, it's real. I think the evapotranspiration, like the types of water consumption that we think go with natural processes, like beaver wetlands and the vegetation that transpires, all the expanded surface area of water that's exposed to the air that evaporates, I don't think any of those really fall in the purview of what we can control or legally mandate. But I do think to restore a wetland that's dried up, and think of Ellen's photos of the beads that were, you know, she called them degraded and dried wetlands, you know, where the beavers had been gone for a long time, and you just have this like simple incised channel running through it. When you take that system to restore that back to a healthy functioning wetland, well, and Emily had these exact pictures too. She had her dry stream without beavers, stream with beavers. Stream without beavers was like a dry sponge. The stream with beavers was a wet sponge. Well, it takes water to do that. So if you look back, the history of what it took to dry out a wetland, that water had to flow downstream at one point. You had to pull the plug on that wetland and drain it out. In order to restore it, beavers, some other natural force needs to put that plug back in, and the wetland has to fill back up. And I've watched this happen many times because this is what we do for a living, is try to restore these wet areas. It takes water to do that, and you can dry up a stream if you restore it too fast. That situation creates downstream a change in stream discharge that you can see. You can measure it. And that is a potential real loss that's very acute. It's usually over days or hours. And if I was downstream and I was a water user that was very dependent on that system, I'd be very nervous if that was happening. And that loss, that water it takes to refill them, and once they're full, they come to equilibrium and water flows through. So I often wonder, like, what's the big deal? Do these slow water down? Well, not, I mean, a little bit. I mean, there's some attenuation, but the water comes into a wetland, comes out, but there is a loss temporarily while you're actually physically restoring them. So I could see an opening there where that's the only time I really feel like I'm really doing something that could hurt somebody.
Yeah, Sean, maybe offer some perspective on who might take issue with a stream restoration project upstream drying up their headgate. Me.
I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to take the liberty of going around the tree a little bit. There is, in our area, we have lots of county-owned open space farms, both in fee and easement, and the ditches run through them. And the county open space program has sort of this ag mission and this natural resource ecosystem mission. So the ecosystem side of it is, hey, let's allow the water that runs through those ditches to grow vegetation. And those vegetation consumes water. But the vegetation creates good habitat. And consequently, in one of our areas upstream of Longmont, we have great Prebbles habitat. And cool for the Prebbles. What does the ditch owner get to do? How do we deal with that? And then fast forward to the Marshall fire that had fire ripping out of the foothills down into urban communities, and lots of witnesses saying the fire traveled down the ditches. And the ditches were on fire because of all the vegetation. And they said, how dare those ditch companies not take care of the vegetation? Okay. Actually, there's a statute that requires ditch owners to maintain their ditches and not allow vegetation to accrue because it consumes water. And in our area, where those same Prebbles ditches were, they got a cease and desist from the state of Colorado. So my going around the tree is the question around should nature, beavers have a right, should nature have a right, its ability to consume water? I'm conflicted about it because I live within the law currently, and the law doesn't say it can. So as a government wonk whose mission is to uphold prior appropriation, it's difficult for me to go there. I do think what Mark is saying about, what's our sort of baseline? What are we trying to establish? What's the water term being injury? What's the impact to that water right holder? Does it reach an equilibrium at some point? Does the sponge actually help with fire issues that, again, go back to the sediment and fire going in town and all those things? I do think that all those things are achievable within the system that we have. It's hard. It's been long time to get from prior appropriation as we knew it, which basically amounted to suck every drop dry as hard as you can and don't let it go to Nebraska and Kansas, to allowing for what Kelly referred to earlier as an in-stream flow to protect fish species, to later the stream restoration bill, to later, or before that, a recreation water right that allowed for recreational purposes. Those models show some ability to say, okay, let's go ahead and do it. What I get concerned about, and this is St. Vrain Left-Hand Water Conservancy District talking, is if we're not able to have these kind of conversations and work at it as a practical matter on the landscape, I think the voters of Colorado will eventually say, enough's enough. We can't stand the fact that there are winners and losers when it comes to this precious resource of water, or winners and losers when it comes to the ecosystem. And they will be very interested in solutions to that. And the solution to that from a voter perspective is, let's vote in a constitutional change called rights of nature. And let's allow nature to have a right, and settles that conversation altogether. No one has to ask it, it has a right. St. Vrain Left-Hand Water Conservancy District, on my own personal belief, that's not going to really be great for Colorado. I think it makes all of our lives infinitely more difficult. And in fact, I don't think it actually would achieve what folks would likely sign on to and think it was going to achieve. And in fact, I think it would be, I believe, 6 feet under by the time it gets litigated and resolved in Colorado. So I think all the while, it's just going to be the Wild West. So I do think we can get there. I think we can get there with the system we have in place. I think we're making advancements and changing the system to continue to get there. But I think we have to have these conversations on a practical standpoint and get down to sort of brass tacks. What is the injury? And then location, location, location. And can we pull it off within the system without making many changes, but continue to evolve and make changes such that we can get to where we're feeling like we as humans are doing what we can to have nature sort of have that baseline of sustainability for us and then manage around that.
All right, Mark. So our system of water governance, the prior appropriation system, Sean feels like it's working for us. It's adaptable. We hope it's adaptable enough. What do you think? Is it working for us?
I mean, it's confusing, it's complicated, but I think it necessarily is that. I've read my Eleanor Ostrom, and I understand like what it takes to avoid the tragedy of the commons, and we're in that situation with a very limited common water supply right now. And Eleanor Ostrom is an economist who says the tragedy of the commons isn't inevitable, because what happens is when you've got a limited resources, people actually work together and form contracts to make sure nobody cheats and takes more than their share. And that's what prior appropriations does. And I think it's almost sacred to a point now, because if you break that system down, like I don't know what happens. It's not, so maybe it's not perfect, but it's certainly something I think we need. But I don't think you can put evapotranspiration from, a wetland surface, or, the transpiration from some sedge within the prior appropriations doctrine. I think it has to live, the doctrine has to live within all those things that nature is doing.
So one thing that Mark and I have talked about offline, and the three of us had talked through with stream restoration and other things, is typically the way that would be addressed in Colorado is you make it exempt. So let's just say we all got together and we were able to put our thumbs up and say, all right, great, what Mark's advocating for, let's make that all exempt. There was a time during the stream restoration bill where that was a word that was being used, is it's going to be exempted. And there were moments where we're sitting in rooms having these conversations, and the water right owners immediately went to large numbers. I mean, very large numbers. And even with beaver dams, it was like, well, are you going to have a 30-acre beaver dam? Could you beaver dam the entire South Platte out by Sterling? That was an active conversation. And nobody really had the answer. It was more like, no, we're not going to do that. But an exemption, why not? And then, and this is how fun water is, it went to, so what would prevent someone from making a beaver dam, quote unquote, and making it look like it was all for the good of the thing, but they're wetting their stuff for them to derive value out of something else, whether that's subsurface irrigation or create, I don't know, a golf course amenity, whatever that is. And you sort of go, yeah, what would prevent that? So again, I think having conversations such as this and Mark sort of saying, okay, are there certain baseline conditions that we can accept? Let's get some numbers. And it's a conversation Mark and I have had. What are we talking about here? And if it's tenths of an acre foot losses in a particular area or consumption that are going on in that area, great. Let's just talk about that. As a society, as a community, we can afford to have conversations around what are the risks and what are the losses. And we did that with stream restoration. We did that with in-stream flows. We did that with recreational and channel diversions. I mean, we got into the numbers and people were willing to do that. Absent those numbers, that community will go 0 to 60 and start thinking big things. And frankly, I like when they came back and said, what would prevent someone from ... And you start to think about it and go, I don't know. I don't know what would prevent someone from doing that. And we know in Colorado in the West, water is a key economic driver. So if money's involved, you can start to crank on how some nefarious things could go on, not necessarily for the benefit of nature or the ecosystem, but for pockets. But they'll disguise it as this is a natural thing.
Yeah, that's, I'm 100% with that. There, as soon as you turn something into law, everybody figures out how to game it. And that's where it's scary to put, something, like stamp it into law. And I think to avoid that inevitability, these conversations have to happen. Because case by case basis, I don't think these are really a big deal. Like I think, well, I mean, they're kind of a big deal, but they're not a huge deal.
Conference around it.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, no, it's really important, but it's not that much water. I don't think it's going to make or break society to restore our wetlands, at least in our headwaters where it's, fairly easy to do so. And we're lucky it's fairly easy to do so. There's probably people at this conference from Europe that are like wishing they could have this opportunity over again. So I forgot what I was going to say next. It was something awesome.
Well, how about well, so you have your chance to say something awesome because I'm going to ask you two to switch hats. You can do it literally or figuratively, but I want you, Mark, to characterize Sean's perspective on this issue, and then we'll switch. And Sean, I want you to characterize Mark's perspective on this issue. So, Mark, go for it.
I think from Sean's perspective, he's really there to make sure every water user gets their share. If we don't use water, or we don't have all these nice things that we've become dependent on, our society depends on it, and that's a very critical job. It's making sure that nobody cheats, that everybody gets what they need and what they're legally entitled to. So I can understand there being concern, especially. So I mean, I guess that's that part I totally get, and I also know that Sean wants dearly to preserve nature and natural functions, and even said so in so many words when it comes down to like it makes maintenance easier sometimes, and we get that a lot. So I would say what I'm sensing mostly is like a cautious optimism. Like, yeah, we can do this, but we need to be very careful how we do it.
Thank you. Mark was acknowledging how he's been wrong the whole time. No. As Mark said, or Kelly said, we're going to do this in front of all of you. So it's been a real treat to sort of go through these mental paces again. And what I've always appreciated about Mark is he does listen. I'll put in a plug. I think it's on YouTube, Mark. You did a video presentation where he talked about the principles of charity and actually echoed a lot of what he had heard from people like me and others. And Mark is really talented at really truly listening. And what I like about Mark is he's willing to push as well. And he does it in a way that's non-threatening. And that really just endears people to sort of re-listen back. What I hear from Mark continually is that what I call sort of that baseline, that, you know, nature works when nature works. The system works when natural systems are functioning at their highest. And as an advocate of that, I have a great appreciation for that. And I intellectually understand how that could benefit the entirety of the system, and that we could actually, like as I said earlier, have our cake and eat it too. And so Mark's been a great advocate for trying to create the space to have that conversation on how do we get back to that baseline and have these good functioning systems.
Great. Well, if you guys feel like Sean and Mark did a good job of applying the principles of charity to this debate, go ahead and give them a round of applause. And I know we're just about at time, so I just want to thank you all for taking the last hour to sit here and enjoy this, and I hope you all can go and apply the principles of charity and whatever conflict you're facing in your work. Thanks, everyone.